to identify hearing loss in students with a visual impairment. So welcome to our Lunch and Learn. And our hope is that we will provide you with some information in considering and how to identify hearing loss in your students you serve, along with the implications of hearing loss. So Judica has joined me today. I'll let you take an opportunity to say hello and introduce yourself.
Certainly.
Thank
Well, thank you so very much for inviting me. I am Judica Mehta. I am one of the consultants at Region 10. My responsibilities include speech language pathology. I am also responsible for facilitating the deaf and hard of hearing process in Region 10. And I'm part of the AT team. Since I'm an SLP, my focus is communication, AAC, augmentative and alternative communication devices and such. So if you have any questions about any of these areas, feel free to reach out. I think we have our contact information on the last slide. And so I'm happy to help in any way that I can. Besides being at Region 10, I'm also faculty at Texas Women's University in the Department of Communication Sciences and Oral Health. And over there, I do some of the research as well in communication issues associated with some of our deaf and hard of hearing individuals. And I have a couple of information from a research that I had done in the past that I will be talking about as well. So that's me in a nutshell.
Well, thank you, Judica. My name's Elaine Sven, and I work here as a consultant in the area of visual impairment and DeafBlind. So I'm available in those areas. All right, so there are future Lunch and Learns coming up, and there's 3 that I think might be interesting to you. One is on conversation boxes. This will cover what a conversation box is and how it can be used to promote communication, concept development, increasing independence, shared attention, and use within a structured routine. We also have, and that first one is scheduled for December 16th. The second one is for January 5th, and that is the hierarchy of cueing and prompting. This session will cover information on sharing how we convey support to students in order to increase independence. On February 22nd, we are doing a Lunch and Learn on sensory boxes for visually impaired students. This session will cover different types of sensory boxes, calming, alerting, and exposures to textures with hands, and how to use them with students with visual impairment. Please let us know how, if you find other topics that you would like to have as Lunch and Learns. We'd be happy to develop training to meet your needs. All right, the first thing on the agenda is to allow you an opportunity to fill out, record your attendance. You have 2 options. You can use the bit.ly that is available or the QR code. I'm going to give you just a moment or two to complete that. Also, I wanted to say, if you are seeking credit for this, please be sure and keep your camera on so that we know that you're in attendance for the credit. Does anybody need more time?
Elaine, I also wanted to just confirm that everybody knows that our VI regional meeting is going to be on January 24th from 9 to 4 p.m. And sign up is available through ESC Works.
Thank you, Alexa.
Sure.
So I'm not seeing anyone that needs more time. So I am going to change the slide. We'll get started. And Judika, you're up. We'll let you discuss the next slide.
Okay, well, thank you so very much. The beginning part of this presentation kind of covers information about the brain development and what happens as a result of sensory deprivation in some of the neurological processes. Sensory deprivation makes a big difference, as I'm probably preaching to the choir. Any sensory deprivation creates changes in the neural networks, and that shows up in various ways. We do know that in the early years, as an infant and as young children, we primarily learn everything in the world, mainly language through our senses, right? Auditory and visual. And then, of course, when we have kiddos who have deficits in these or do not have appropriate input from these senses, that creates difficulty with overall development of the brain. And so we're going to talk a little bit about neuroplasticity. Elaine, can we go to the next slide? So before we get to the neuroplasticity, we need to identify what constitutes hearing loss, right? And hearing loss, simply defined as any degree of impairment to comprehend sound. Very simple definition. Anytime we have deficit in perceiving certain ranges of sound, that constitutes hearing loss. And you have probably know, or you have it in the back of your mind, that in humans, humans can perceive sounds anywhere between 20 to 20,000 hertz. It's a pretty wide range of sounds that we can perceive. Although most of us are probably not going to be able to perceive that sound in the higher frequency range. Thank you. Going back to our ability to perceive a wide range of sounds, from the developmental perspective, we reach our peak when it comes to perception of sound, and I'm talking about typically developing brains. Typically, a peak was when we were in our teens, right? 16 to 19 years of age is when we had the best ability to perceive sound. After that, we start losing that ability. It's all downhill from there, right? And yeah, I know it sucks to grow old, but hearing is one of the areas that gets severely impacted as we grow, as we age. And our ability to perceive some of these environmental sounds starts diminishing. So in adults, a significant number of adults will experience some kind of a hearing loss at some point. I myself have a mild hearing loss, and yes, sometimes it does interfere with my ability to understand. And I realized that during the pandemic, when everyone is wearing a mask, and I did not have those visual cues to be able to perceive what was being said. And it just drove home the point how much of attention we have, or at least people with hearing impairment pay on visual cues to comprehend communication and everything that is being said. So when we do have an impairment to comprehend sound, that is what is defined as hearing loss, and that can be either partial or total. And especially if we throw in our the visual impairment, with some we work with that we see in some of our kiddos, that just compounds the problem. So going back to our neuroplasticity perspective, hearing loss does create difficulties in development of a brain. Elaine, can we go to the next one, please? So this is something I talk to the parents about all the time. We are born with hearing, but we have to learn how to hear. we don't hear with the ears, we hear with our brains. Our ears are simply a conduit to take the sound from the environment into our brain, and the brain makes sense of the sound that we perceive. So when we have children who have hearing impairment, parents sometimes simply presume that, oh, we got them hearing aids, or we got them cochlear implants. So somehow that hearing loss is fixed, and from the very next day, they will be able to communicate just fine. They will be able to talk and do everything like a typically developing child. Unfortunately, that is not the case. What the aids are doing, whether it's cochlear implants or hearing aids or any type of amplification, it simply amplifies the information, the sounds that is coming into the brain. The brain still needs to be trained how to make sense of that sound, right? And to some degree, it's a little bit different than a visual impairment. So if you have, if a child has a need for glasses, getting corrective lenses, and the world is very clear. They still have to learn how to make sense of that visual input that is coming through. The brain still have to make sense of it, but it is a little bit more simpler compared to the sound. So if I say something like, Aaj Guruwar hai, did that make any sense? Probably not, unless you speak Hindi. I just said in Hindi that today is Thursday. And you heard it all. It made the sound went to your brain just fine. There was no issues with hearing, but your brain couldn't make sense of it because, well, you don't know the language. And that is what we have to explain to the parents often, that we still have to get them appropriate help. We still have to provide like speech therapy or assistance with, in resource classroom, or additional help primarily to make sure the brains know how to hear. We have to teach the brains how they can hear. Okay, any questions about any of these? And you probably all know this. I mean, this as teachers of deaf and blind kiddos, you know this. But sometimes I feel that we have to make sure the parents and other education professionals know this as well. Our classroom teachers may not quite understand the nuances, and other professionals who work with them are paraprofessionals. Sometimes we have interveners, so whoever is working with them may not quite understand this, and we have to just make it more clear for them. Any questions and comments on that? Oh, I see some thumbs up. Okay, all right, we'll just keep going. Elaine, can we go to the next one? So here are some of the, and you probably again know this information, that from hearing is about brain and brain development. So as I mentioned earlier, our ears receive the sound, but our brains have to make sense of it. And any amount, even minimal amount of sensory deprivation, and those neurological pathways that are associated with it atrophy. So in terms, one of the principles of neuroscience is that if we don't use it, we lose it. And that is important to understand, because there are certain parts of the brain, real estate in the brain is limited, and nature in all her wisdom has determined that we need certain parts of the brain to work well for certain skills. And so we have auditory cortex for hearing, and we have visual cortex for making sense of vision, and so on, right? So what happens is, when that stimulation is not coming in early years, the auditory cortex, or the parts of the brain that are associated with making sense of the sounds that are coming in, decide like, why are we reserving the space for this particular process when really it's the process is not happening. So it gets repurposed. Those areas get repurposed for something else, because we do need, real estate in the brain is premium. So that those areas start to atrophy, or these areas start to shrink. And a lot of times when it comes to auditory deprivation, the part of the brain which is associated with vision tends to take over the auditory portion, and vice versa. Sometimes when we have visual impairment, the auditory cortex tends to become larger in these individuals, and you probably have seen that, right? Children with visual impairment seem to have a higher sensitivity to auditory information, and vice versa. So when these kiddos do get adjusted, these kiddos do get hearing aids, there is a period of adjustment that takes place. Yeah, eventually the auditory cortex can be made to be expanded based on the kind of intervention we are providing. And that's the beauty of the brain. That's what neuroplasticity is all about. Being able to reorganize, the brain is able to reorganize itself when it gets appropriate sensory input. And we need to take, we in the education, we need to be thinking about how we can potentially provide appropriate stimulation, especially in early years. Early years are so critical. Typically, and you probably know about this from your understanding of the brain, brain is most plastic in the early years till we hit puberty. Till then, puberty is so, anywhere between 9 to 13, 14 years of age. Boys undergo puberty as well. Their signs and symptoms are different. But yes, both girls and boys undergo puberty. And at puberty, the brain undergoes significantly different changes. It does not mean that we cannot learn, but that learning window, what in neuroscience is known as sensitive period, that sensitive period is the most from birth to about that puberty. And we really need to capitalize on that, providing as much sensory input as we can in terms of all the educational parameters that we are providing to really get that those synapses. The synapses are when the pathways in which the neurons talk to each other. So stimulate those synapses and stimulate those neurological pathways. Questions, comments on any of that? Let's just keep going then. Elaine, can we go to the next slide? So how does brain respond to hearing loss? Well, one thing, and this is another thing we have to explain to the parents, that children don't always listen like adults. If as an adult, someone experiences hearing loss, their ability to accommodate for the hearing loss is very different than that of kiddos, mainly because as adult brain has had a period of typical development. Language has developed. They have had the auditory cortex is not going to be much different than a typically developing or typically hearing adult, primarily because they have had a period of normal or well, we don't say normal, I mean, after all, what's normal, but they have a period of typical development. And so adults can perform some of those automatic, sophisticated automatic cognitive closure. So what it means is they can make sense of partial information coming in and still rely on their previous experience of language, world knowledge, all of that to make sense of that, of the information that is coming in, even if parts of it are missing. Children, on the other hand, cannot do that, mainly because there was not a typical period of brain development. First of all, the auditory cortex is not fully developed till almost 14 to 15 years of age. So there is that brain development, the period of a brain development that has to be accounted for, and the fact that language and their world experience and everything is still continuing to be developed. So children's brain does not always respond to the hearing loss like that of an adult. Elaine, next slide. And we do know that neuroplasticity is typically the greatest in the first year of life. We know a lot more about brain than we did even 5 years ago. The first year of life is critical. And the fact that our children who may have congenital hearing loss or congenital visual impairment, they are missing out significantly. And then we need to figure out somehow to amplify those sounds and provide appropriate habilitation, perhaps in different ways, using the modalities that are already present, tactile or I think primarily it is the tactile. We don't use much of olfactory or the taste buds in terms of communication. But we do know that in absence of sound or absence of vision, the brain does reorganize to receive input from the other senses. And that is what we know as in the literature is referred to as crossmodal reorganization. The senses that are working take over larger and larger part of the brain. Elaine, next one. So this was a study that I had done a few years ago. This was with one of my doctoral students, where we looked at children with cochlear implants. They were between the ages of 9 and 12. So and everybody this was before they had hit puberty. And what we did was we looked at their visual processing abilities. We did not touch their auditory cortex or anything, or any of their audition abilities. We just looked at how their vision is in children with cochlear implants. And so we asked them to do a very simple visual task. All they had to do is, it's a sequencing task. So on a screen, they will be seeing circles, squares, triangles pop up, and they have to, it will be there on the screen for a period of time, and they have to then develop their, they have to some degree, there is some recall associated with it, but they still have to visually sequence that information. And this is what we found. Elaine, next slide, please. So what we found is, if you see on that bar graph, CI is cochlear implant group and NH is the normal hearing group. So on that bar, you can see on the second panel, on the x-axis is the group and the y-axis is the reaction time. And the cochlear implant group took significantly, almost 1,000 milliseconds. 1,000 milliseconds is 1 second for every single visual processing task that they engaged in. And we are talking about single word. If they take our children, and these children have had cochlear implants for at least the minimal of 3 to 5 years. So it's not like they are recently aided. They have had experience. They have had auditory information in the brains, and they have had educational experiences and so on. In spite of that, they are still delayed. About 1,000 milliseconds. The same information is represented in a graphical format. It's latency in millisecond on the x-axis on the first panel, and the amplitude, how much their neurons are firing. This is like a firing of each individual neuron. And you can see the peak, what we call P3, which is positivity after certain certain milliseconds. Those peaks are very, very different, indicating almost 1,000 millisecond difference. And we are talking about in one word. So if they are reading after reading every word, they are falling behind by 1 second. Think about the end of a 5-word sentence. They're already behind by 5 seconds. Think of an end of a paragraph or an end of a page. How much delays they're experiencing as they are processing information. And if you think about it, if they're falling behind and they're still processing information in the beginning of the page, and we are talking about information at the end of the page, that's going to create a lot of confusion. At some point, they're going to give up, like, oh, this is too hard. I don't know what's going on, and I'm tuning out. And those are the kind of things sometimes that ends up as behavioral problems, or in some instances, they're just sitting in the class. They seem to be listening, but they are thinking about something else. And that is something I think we need to bear in mind, that in spite sometimes after adequate stimulation, we still see these delays. And that is something we probably have to accommodate for as we are providing learning experiences. Lucinda, I think you asked, is this because a sound is somehow distorted? Put possibly, because even if they are fully aided, you know, they don't hear, it's not the normal sound, the normal frequencies, they don't hear the way we do. That is a possibility, but we did not look at the auditory aspect as well. This is primarily visual. So there was no auditory any kind of feedback or any stimulation they were getting, at least not in the study. So what we concluded, and there's some other research that supports this this conclusion as well. What we think happens is because there was a period of time in their early childhood that they did not have appropriate auditory stimulation, and we do know the visual cortex possibly took over to some degree, and then when sound was provided, perhaps they have the sound was to some degree distorted. That can be potentially a potential reason for that. But we also do think that our sensory input do interact to a significant degree. What we see, what we hear, there is an interactive pathway. So when one sensory feed is not coming in appropriately, the other sensory feed have some amount of impact. We don't know exactly. Of course, it changes, and there is an individual variation as well. But this study, and if you like, I have several studies supporting it, indicates that when we work with children with any sensory deficits, keep in mind that there is a possibility of deficits in other sensory areas as well, even though it seems like there is no identified deficit. So in these kiddos, there is no identified visual impairment, or in a VI kiddos, there is no identified deaf and hard of hearing, or no identified hearing loss. They still seem to indicate, or they still seem to function as there might be a minor or a mild deficit. Again, there's a lot of research that is currently going on. We don't have all the answers, but a lot of conclusions seem to support it. So the takeaway point from this information is that please do pay attention to their for deaf and hard of hearing, pay attention to the reading skills. If it's a VI kiddo, pay attention to how they're processing some of the sound and language that is coming in, because, and if there are any deficits, don't simply attribute it to the VI problem. There actually might be a auditory processing issue in these VI kiddos that we are serving. Questions, comments?
We have a couple of things in the chat. Is this a time when we want to address that?
Sure.
Okay. So Lucy is asking, is this because the sound is somehow distorted?
Yes,
I back a little bit.
Right, I talked about that a little bit. It's possible. It's maybe because the sound is somewhat distorted. We don't really know, but even in some of these kids who had mild, who had relatively, even though they have cochlear implants, yes, there'll always be some distortion of the sound, but there does seem to be an indication even that visual processing is impacted as well.
And we had one more come in. Who would assess an auditory processing problem?
So auditory processing problem would be your SLP. The SLP and audiologists need to work together to address that auditory processing, because there is an auditory processing disorder. 10 years ago or 15 years ago, if you ask someone if they're about APD, a lot of people would think that is not really a real condition. But now we do know that it is classified as a deficit. It is a real condition. APD is a diagnosis that is pretty much determined by or made by the audiologist and the SLP working together. So talk to them in terms of the audiologists will talk about we'll look into not just the auditory measures, but auditory perception measures. They look at, the speech recognition thresholds, and all of those need to be taken into account. And the SLP will be looking at comprehension and the other areas of language processing. Great questions. Elaine, you want to go to the next slide?
Yes, thank you so much, Judika. That's a great overview when we are looking at the significance of hearing loss on neurological development. There's some familiar themes from our bases, professionals working with visually impaired children. Learning to use vision is a significant part of our work, and knowing that the brain sees are parallels to our understanding of the development of vision. So very much in sync with what our backgrounds tell us in VI as well. So let's move on to signs of hearing loss and in students who have visual impairments. We want to think about what are those signs of possible hearing loss in general, and wanted to give you an opportunity to think about that. We can either talk out loud, or you can put your thoughts in chat. We can take it either way. So if you want to unmute yourself to discuss what you see as some of the possible signs, or to put it in chat. We'll give you just a minute to think about that. How do we know? What are those signs that tells us I'm really needing to worry and wonder about hearing loss?
Elaine, there was a question earlier about Karen is asking, is it ever appropriate for us to suggest talking to the doctor about sensory neural hearing loss? And the answer to that, yes, absolutely. As part of, we are part of Child Find, and if you suspect that there is some kind of a hearing loss, or there is some we need to investigate further, absolutely, we need to either bring it up into the art committee or recommend investigating that a little bit further, because after all, we are required to address, or at least assess, if not assess, at least address all areas of suspected disability.
I see we're getting some information through chat. I'll depend on Alexa to.
Yeah, didn't want to interrupt you when you were talking, but yes, we can definitely do that. Okay, so Terry, oh, I'm sorry, that's having to do with being marked present. So when a student doesn't respond to environmental sounds, they should be able to hear. I'm not really sure. When a student doesn't respond to environmental sounds.
Right. So that's anything in the environment, they're just not responding to auditory information.
Okay. Kind of multitasking. Only responding to when the speaker is in front of the hearer, moving lips when being spoken to, like lip reading.
I'm trying to keep up with.
So I think what she's questioning is if somebody is only responding to the person who is speaking when the speaker is directly in front of them, like lip reading the individual. If you're starting to see that as a observation, is that right, Lucy? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, that sounds reasonable. If the child is only responding when in front of that may, mean that they're lip reading, or that they're only hearing when they're directly in front of them. So that's a very good observation.
And then Misty shared, when a student smiles or nods after I ask a question that deserves a verbal response in sentence form.
And they don't respond. That's a good one, Misty. That's
Right.
they
That's
just
what my husband does.
they just smile. Yes.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
They're not understanding.
Yeah.
Okay, and then Judika shared a link here to an article. Lucy says, yes, and some people really don't lip read. They just move their mouths while others talk. My mother does it all the time, and she's significantly hearing impaired. That's interesting. Judika is sharing that this article covers a lot of neural aspects of sensory deprivation.
One of the articles, one of the pieces of information is there was a Harvard study that was done almost a decade ago. You probably are familiar with it. If not, I can give you the link as well. What they did was they looked at a bunch of college graduate, typical undergrads and graduate students at Harvard. And what they did was they asked them to come to the lab. They blindfolded them. And I think they were blindfolded and they were doing certain tasks when they were blindfolded. And they were blindfolded for maybe an hour or just hour and a half, not very long. And then, and what they did was they wanted to see what their brain does as a result of those blindfolds. And what they found was that even that hour or hour and a half of deprivation, the sensory, basically visual deprivation, the brain had already started to reorganize. The auditory cortex was kind of infringing upon that visual cortex. And of course, when the blindfold was taken off, very quickly the brain went back to its original form. And this was, and there are several other studies that was one of the pioneering studies, and there are other studies that have started looking into the sensory deprivation. But it was astounding. I mean, even an hour and a half of having that deprivation, and our brains are already beginning to change. And these are not atypical kiddos. These were all Harvard students. And so it's just something that we need to keep in mind, especially with our kiddos who have had years of sensory deprivation or in one form or the other. It takes that much longer to help them reorganize their ability to navigate the environment.
Thank you, Judika. Any other thoughts about signs of hearing loss? I'm going to move on to the next slide, that sort of a list that was created, and I'll go over it with you. Here's some of the time, and then, responds some of the time, but doesn't respond at other times. That's a possible sign. Many things lead to a person responding at sometimes than others. Environmental background sounds, all kinds of things in the environment can lead to that. Here's a good one. I like this one. Wants the TV volume louder than other members of the family. I wonder if anyone has that in their family where the TV volume is louder. They want it. Says that they cannot hear you, that they did not hear you. It seems as though the person or students are not paying attention. Maybe a child looks at you intensely when you speak to them, trying to either lip read or understand by looking. May often say, huh? Does not startle at loud noises. Does not turn to the source of a sound. And that could be an issue. Speech is delayed. Speech is not clear. They can hear, but they cannot understand. So those are all possible signs of hearing loss. And I'm sure we could develop a longer list. But those are some things to look for in your work. Next, we're going to talk about the auditory system. This slide shows the parts of the ear, and anywhere along this system, there can be issues with hearing that cause a hearing loss. The outer ear is part of the system, sometimes in students with charge syndrome or other kind of conditions may not have an outer ear that can cause hearing loss. Anything in the middle ear or the interior. And you can see in the picture, there's the cochlea, and then right by that is the nerve. And that nerve goes to the brain, where the brain is interprets the sound. All right, Judica.
Okay, so this is an audiogram. You're probably all familiar with this. I like this particular one, and it's also easy for parents to understand, and even a classroom teachers to really understand what it means. Is this is color coded, and this goes in terms of decibel levels, in the terms of the sounds that we can perceive, and what constitutes normal hearing, what constitutes severe to profound hearing loss. So what we see, and that on the top, the frequency is from 250 to 8,000 hertz. That is the hearing range of most of the sounds that most of us can hear. Like I mentioned earlier, it's very unlikely that many of us can hear those sounds, those high frequency sounds outside of this range. This is typically hearing speech range sounds as well. Some of us can. I have two teenagers who seem to have incredible hearing when it comes to we are talking about anything of interest to them, and of course they don't hear anything even if I'm standing right in front of them and talk to them sometimes. So selective listening is a completely different situation. But as you can see, majority of us are probably not going to be hearing anything beyond 8 or 10,000 hertz. The green part over there, between minus 10 decibels to about 110 dB is the range in terms of the loudness. Anything typically beyond 110 dB can get into the painful category. I had mentioned one time that I think the record shows that Rolling Stones had the loudest concert or the loudest concert sound at one point. I think they had for a short period of time almost 120 dB, which gets into the pain thresholds. We have burst eardrums and intense headaches and things like that. And those are the sound levels. If you look at the bottom, like airplane flying and helicopters and things like that, their sounds go into that kind of range. But when we have profound hearing loss, the children cannot even hear any of those sounds. So it kind of helps people to understand, and you can show this even to the kiddos themselves, helping them understand the hearing range and what sounds they can and they cannot hear. I think it's important for our children, the kiddos that we work with, understand their ability to perceive certain sounds, and potentially they can be advocates for themselves at some point. So and we'll talk about the speech banana. There is a banana there with certain all those little alphabets in there. That is what we refer to as speech banana. Elaine, you want to go to the next one, please? And this is what the speech banana is. It looks like a banana. We call it a speech banana because the range of average human speech is within this threshold. And all the sounds that we produce, the S sound, the S and the F and the TH, they are high frequency sounds. And then of course we have the V's and the buzz and the J's, and those are some of the lower frequency sound. And that is the range of sound we we perceive. When we have age-related hearing loss progresses, typically we lose that high frequency sounds the earliest. Most of the adults who experience hearing loss is typically in the high frequency range, and they have difficulty telling the difference between stop and top, because the S sound, it's kind of tricky, and that's why they need attention to the visual cues as well. But regardless, this is what they call a speech banana, and it gives us an understanding of the type of sounds our children may, the kind of phonemes, which is the sound system of the language, right? Those are the kind of sounds they're missing, and if these sounds get missed, obviously meaning gets impacted, and that leads to comprehension and learning difficulties and so on.
Next slide.
Yes. And so the two main types of hearing losses that we see our kiddos experience is conductive and sensory neural. So conductive hearing loss, as the term suggests, is when sound that is being conducted from the inner ear to the auditory, through the auditory nerve into the brain, is impaired to some degree, because the entire conduction pathway is either there's a barrier in there, such as, if you have excessive wax buildup, or otitis media, which is basically ear infection, or any damage to any of the pathway of the ear. That is what causes conductive hearing loss. And primarily, the primary problem is associated with volume rather than distortion of the sound. And majority of the conductive hearing losses can be corrected for the most part with either, fixing those barriers, removal of the wax, or if there's any damage to the bones, we can do some, ear surgery, and all of that can fix it, or in kind of treatment, antibiotics clear up that infection in the middle ear, and the sound comes in through just fine, and it's everything is good. But we have frequent episodes of, say, ear infection, or a prolonged damage, a period of time when there is a wax buildup and nobody paid attention, and all those little things for a prolonged period of time can potentially result in long-term consequences as well. Even though it is relatively easy to fix conductive hearing loss, consequences to the brain shouldn't be ignored, and that's why we need to pay attention to that early history, especially if this has happened in the early years where that brain development is taking place. It reduces the ability, the sensory input is reduced, so leads to sensory deprivation and difficulties with language learning and so forth. Next, please. Next slide. And sensory neural hearing loss is a type of hearing loss that is developed when there is damage to the cochlea, basically the inner ear. And for the most part, it is permanent. And this is where we experience not just problems with loudness, but the sound itself is distorted. And it's almost like, think about the example I often give is, say, if you're driving in a car and you're listening to the car radio, and if there's a lot, say if the reception is not very good and there is choppiness, you're not getting all the information that is coming through. So parts of the information is missing. Throw in significant static and reduce the volume really, really low, and you miss majority of the information. So it's not just a volume issue, but it's distortion of the signal. And you have to really put in, even for that short period of time, you have to put in so much effort to make sense of that information. Think about if you have to do this 24/7, and at some point you're going to give up. I would give up, like, oh, this is too hard. I cannot just constantly put in that much of cognitive effort. That means as a consequence to that, the input that is coming into my brain is diminished, and it leads to those language and learning difficulties. Unfortunately, the loss is, in this case, you can fix it with cochlear implants and hearing aids, but the distorted sound still stays the same. So we have to work a lot with these kiddos with sensory neural hearing loss, to provide, to accommodate for this damage into the brain.
Thank you. All right. What do you do if you suspect a hearing loss? This is something you can bring up at an ARD meeting. You can request an auditory audiological assessment, which is very valuable to understanding hearing loss. A communication assessment can be requested. Discuss the need for a cognitive assessment, look at academic progress. And also, I didn't put it on this slide, but I would like to add that, contacting the teacher of the deaf and hard of hearing as a partner in all of this is important to do, and what I would suggest in terms of if you suspect a hearing loss. All right, let's look at the causes of deafblindness. And I bring these up on this slide as you are working with students and getting prepared for evaluations, are regardless of whether it's the initial or ongoing. If you have any of these things, these are things to particularly pay attention to in terms of the etiologies of deafblind. Prematurity can be something to look at to make sure that there's not a hearing loss. Obviously, charge syndrome, it's right there in the syndrome. Hearing loss is a part of that syndrome. Usher syndrome, Down syndrome, Stickler syndrome, Danny Walker syndrome, Goldenhar syndrome, and I also put rubella. Rubella is something that we don't see that often. We occasionally see a child today with rubella, but we're pretty much through immunizations, stopped most of that, but occasionally we do see a child with rubella. But if you see any of these conditions, syndromes, these are ones to particularly pay attention to. Okay, so let's look at deafblind eligibility. I have a new graphic that was developed by Region 11 recently, and I think it's really important for us in looking at deafblind eligibility, because if you already have a child that has visual impairment and you suspect hearing loss, these are the 4 ways that you can qualify a student as deafblind. Obviously, the first one in the green, eligibility for deaf and hard of hearing, or eligibility for VI. Those are kind of standalones in that case, but if the child is eligible for both, they are eligible to be labeled as deafblind. You can also be eligible in the pink, eligible for visual impairment and have a hearing loss that's suspected but inconclusive. But the key thing here is if you have a speech delay, no speech, then that is a way to identify a child as deafblind. In the blue, a progressive or hearing and vision loss, anytime you have both of those going on, Like if you have a child with ushers, then they automatically qualify as being eligible as deafblind. In the yellow, I want to talk about this a little bit. This is called the third way, even though I'm talking about it as the fourth way. This is a combination of hearing and vision loss. But alone, they may not qualify. So the child may not qualify as having a hearing impairment eligibilities wise, but or they may not apply, be eligible as having a vision loss as a standalone. But combined, those two mild is what I think we refer to this group as. The combined loss creates a lot of issues for the child, and that the child is eligible to be qualified in that if they have a mild kind of thing. This is a very intense kind of process to figure out at times, and requires us as teachers of the visually impaired and the teachers of hard of hearing to work together to see how that loss creates issues in the classroom. Many children have been missed in this group, and actually they're kind of the easiest to help in many ways. A mild that giving assistive listening devices, or just doing simple things in the classroom may help them overcome some of the combined loss. But it does magnify their access to sensory information when they're mild. All right. So significance of identifying hearing loss. It's important to do that so that we can provide access for our children in the classroom. And that can be in the form of assistive listening devices, hearing aids, along with the cochlear implants, seatings. And note that we are looking at a combined loss to make sure that there's a good fit between the two for accommodations. And it's important for the team to work together to make those recommendations. There's one accommodation I think it's very important to talk about here that kind of is important. As we know in orientation and mobility, that travel is very important for our students. A lot of times, the audiologist does not, their focus is to get rid of background noise. And that's exactly what you need at a street crossing in order to be safe, is to have that background noise. So we need to make sure that there's specialized settings on their hearing aids so that that's available to them. So a lot of times when I'm working with with a person that has a combined loss, that's something that we look for in their hearing aids, is to make sure that that's a factor. Another thing that was shared with me recently that I thought was a great accommodation is sometimes in a classroom where if there's a vision loss and a hearing loss, it may be something as simple as the instructor wearing lip, something on their lips, so that they stand out a little more in order for the student to be able to see for lip reading. So that's just another thought. All right, I'm going to change slides. The significance of identifying hearing loss in students with a visual impairment, the impact on the educational program. I wanted to just get your thoughts. And
Elaine, we also have some things in the chat. Do you want to cover those real quick?
Sure.
Okay, so Karen is asking, does a student need to be failing before we can consider a DHH assessment?
No. They don't need to be failing. We just need to recognize there's a need there. And same thing would be with the vision loss. Does that make
It starts with a concern, right? Like you've got a concern that you then follow through with what the concern is, and does it have any connection to the hearing aspect of the student's abilities?
Yes, because it may be, a child doesn't have to fail in order for us to look at hearing loss. It may be just that, such an improvement just by making simple accommodations in the classroom.
Okay, and then Lorraine is asking, will a student be able to localize during travel outdoor while using an FM system in place? Judica?
Do you want to?
So it depends. The answer is it depends on the FM system. The whole intent of an FM system is to improve the signal to noise ratio. So it amplifies the signal and dampening out the other sounds. So the student can focus on that speech signal without much of cognitive effort. That is the intent of the FM system, to amplify the sound. Now, some of the newer FM systems do come with the localization features. Majority of them are more of a indoor that needs to be, sometimes it's added upon or sometimes it's inbuilt. It just depends on the FM system you have. And same thing will apply to the outdoor, whether it works outdoors the same way. And it's not a straightforward answer whether all FM systems can do it. Potentially the newer ones can, but again, it's an additional feature that you'll have to talk to the vendors about. If localization is a concern and you want that feature, then we have to discuss this with the vendors when you're purchasing it. Some of the older ones can be retrofitted, not everyone, but few of them can be retrofitted with the localization feature. But again, that is a conversation to have with the vendor of the system.
Okay, and then Yvette is asking, is meningitis another cause of deafblindness?
Yes, sure can be, and that's a good one for the list.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Thank you, Yvette. I just note, when my child, who's now 32 years old, was 6 weeks old, she had meningitis. And she did not have any lasting effects, but I knew too much as a young mother about the impact. So I was sure looking for it, and turned out to be viral instead of bacterial. So that helps as well. I can just say that prior to working here at Region 10, I worked at Chris Cole Rehabilitation Center in Austin, which is an adult, many of you know about this, adult rehab center for people who are visually impaired, blind. In my work there, I brought the DeafBlind program to the center, and we discovered very quickly that about 30% of our customers had a hearing loss. So that's pretty profound when you think about it, that people attending what CCRC, Chris Cole Rehab Center, that we eventually identified about 30% had a hearing loss, and the impact that we could make by aiding them in some way. Maybe that's making sure they have a hearing aid and getting a good audiological for that purpose, making sure the background settings are there for mobility. All of those kind of things make a difference. Oh, since VI kiddos experience reading issues due to visual processing delays, and having it reiterated that hearing loss causes auditory processing delays, it's essential that we are identifying this early and often, as the saying goes. Thank you, Lucinda. And Yvette says, I've had some questions about students with hearing loss having some vision issues, acuities for 20/40. When do you look into evaluating? All right, well, I'm going to ask the group to think about that. When would we look at evaluating? 20/40 is such a static number that more information, I think, about the general vision condition might be helpful as we go about that. And I would look at the environment, get the teacher of the deaf and hard of hearing, speech language, if necessary, involved, so that you can analyze the possibilities there. I hope that answers. I don't see it as a cut and dried thing. It's like a treasure hunt. You go and you look and you see, is there an impact? I'm an advocate of using interviews with families and teachers and others to try to pick up on where some of those issues may start to be a problem. And with those interviews, I think you might get some answers, about where the possibilities for where that may be impacting them. I see something in the chat, but I can't quite see it. Can you see that?
I've got it. Are we at the one that says, we've been told in my district that acuities are now looked at less and that we need to really look at the educational impacts? So I'd say evaluate if you have any questions or concerns.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Well, it is not about acuities. It is about function. And so you're going to hear more and more about that. That's the way it is in the adult arena as well as in our educational arena, that we need to tweak our thinking more to what is the functional impact of vision or hearing loss on the child's educational performance. And is there something we can do about it?
And Elaine, we have another one. Another TBI going through TBD program helped me understand about dual loss this way. If coded VI, are your recommendations auditory based, and vice versa? If coded AI, are accommodations visually based? So I think what she's talking about is the deaf-blind piece.
Okay. I think that's Misty. Misty, could you explain that a little bit more? I understand. If coded VI, are your recommendations auditorily based? All right. I'm going to go on to resources. The next page, there's a few resources. one of my favorite resources is the national db.org website. And I put an informal functional hearing evaluation that is in there. It's got interviews, and it's really designed toward the students that have vision loss, and multiple disabilities is basically what it is. But there are interviews in there that you could pull for other students if you wanted to see if those are helpful to you. But all of these resources are good ones for you to look at for further information. I think in wrapping up, we had some folks that were having trouble signing in. Alexa volunteered to capture your name and we can get you signed up.
Yes, I have made a list of everybody that attended today, and I am going to walk this over to my assistant who will put all this in. So if you have any problems, if you don't see a evaluation request in your inbox, then let me know and I can send you something directly. But I think I've got everybody that's been on here on my list.
So the other thing I wanted to mention is that I sent out the slide deck handouts to you. If for some reason you didn't get that, let me know and I'll send it to you. I know that there was at least one person that wasn't able to get in, and we worked out that link, I hope. So anyway, here is our contact information, Judica and Elaine on here. So I just want to shout out, thank you, Judica Meta, for being with us. We appreciate your expertise. It was very insightful. Thank you very much for joining us today. Alexa, thanks to you for being our point person. And thanks to our audience for being here. I know that we covered a lot, and there are pieces of this that we can develop other trainings on. So if there's something that you want us to highlight and go in more depth with, please let us know and we'd be happy to do that.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. This was it's always a pleasure to talk to different groups. So thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, everybody. Have a great day.